and I'm pleased to report my herniated disc flare-up is well on the way to recovery. And thanks a lot for all those great comments, get well soon comments you made on my last video. And you've probably noticed there's something different about me. I've had a shave. My wife gave me an ultimatum, either I get a shave or she'll stay. Now you join me at Hayward Nature Reserve, and before my problem with the back I was walking around here most days for exercise. You know, this is where I take a lot of my bird photography. It's a fantastic site, and but I haven't walked around for 3 weeks, so come on, let's get on with the walk. There have been some interesting developments here since I brought you last. We've got 2 buzzards that come in regularly, and buzzards are our most abundant bird of prey in the UK. In fact, North Wiltshire, where we are, is a really good place for buzzards. And despite their impressive size, they're not really great predators. They like to feed on things like earthworms and carrion. And in fact, a year ago, I counted 22 buzzards in one field worming, only about a couple of kilometres away up the road. So I say, this is a great place for buzzards. Although buzzards are abundant, it doesn't make them easy to photograph. They're quite wary of humans, and they're quite difficult to get close to. And a couple of weeks ago I put some carrion down on a post just on the other side of the reserve, and the following day I was walking through and there was a buzzard busily finishing off the carrion. Now I managed a couple of photographs, and I'll show you one now. Now once the lockdown's over, I'm going to start a regular feeding regime, trying to get the buzzards in regularly so I can take some great perched shots. And what I'll do when I do that, I'll put a video together to show you how I get on. Now I've also noticed some new and smaller visitors to the reserve, and these are one of our declining species here in the UK, marsh tit, a beautiful little bird. Now we've lost about 50% of our marsh tit population in the UK, largely down to habitat loss. So that puts them on the red list, which means the species is in urgent need of attention. Now despite its name, the marsh tit prefers really damp deciduous woodland, just like Hayward. So there's a fair chance that now they're here we might be able to get them established. So I'm really excited by the prospect. So when lockdown finishes, I'll try my best to get some perch shots of the marsh tit just to show you all. And that really links nicely to the theme of this video. So this video is about my favoured camera settings for perch birds and for general bird photography. And I'll also be showing you some of my images over the last few years. So let's get home and get started. On the way, as a taster, I'm just going to show you some perched and general bird photography I took last year. Okay. Hello, I'm Phil Gower from Phil Gower Bird Photography. Thank you for clicking through to join me on another video. Now I'm feeling really happy today. I've just completed my first walk for ages at the reserve and my back stood up to it. I had my first coronavirus vaccination yesterday, and this only cost me 99p, and at last I have the house to myself.
Have you done those dishes yet?
Not yet, darling, but I'm on the case. Anyway, this video is all about my camera settings for perched and general bird photography. Before we start, let me qualify what I mean by perched and general bird photography. This refers to birds perched on anything like branches, fences and wires, birds on the ground, and birds in or on the water. So any bird image other than flight shots, because I covered birds in flight photography in 2 previous videos on this channel. I'll provide links below to these in the description. My assumption here is that you already have the equipment you need for bird photography. If you're a beginner and want some advice on what gear to purchase, I'll be happy to answer questions if you put them in the comments section below. If I get lots of questions, I'll also consider putting a video together on bird photography gear. I'm going to use the same format with perched and general bird photography I use with birds in flight photography. This first video will be about my camera settings and showing you some of my favourite images, so you can get a good feel of my credentials, so to speak. And the second video will be about technique, tips and tricks for perched and general bird photography. Now, I may have to divide this second video into a few parts because I think it might be epic. So let's look at camera settings. The camera settings I talk about in this video are my favourite settings for general bird photography, using the Sony a7R4 and the Sony a9 II. They're what I know and what I use. But they'll also apply to most other camera systems available today, and certainly Canon cameras, which I've also used for many years. One caveat before we start. By no means are the settings I use the only settings you can use to take great bird images. If you have other settings you use, please share them with all the viewers in the comments below. We all want to learn and improve. One general principle I should share with you. As far as possible, my settings for perched and general bird photography mirror my settings for flight photography, with just a few differences. And this is intentional for 2 reasons. Firstly, it means when I'm out birding, I don't need to worry about camera settings and changing things when I'm presented with different types of shots, i.e. flight or perch shots. It's really important to me. I want to spend maximum time on finding birds and fashioning and taking great shots, not with my head buried in the menus and fiddling with custom buttons. Secondly, they are simply the best perched and general bird photography settings for me. So let's take a look at my settings. First things first, let's start by talking about shooting mode. I'm guessing by now, if you've seen my previous videos, you know I exclusively shoot in manual mode and auto ISO. And if you need help setting this up, refer to this video above. So why is this shooting mode right for me? I love manual mode with auto ISO because I get direct control of both the shutter speed and the aperture. And this control has helped me take the types of pictures you've already seen so far in this video and my favourite all-time images you'll see at the end. In this mode you indirectly get control of the ISO and image quality through aperture and shutter speed. I know many bird photographers use fully manual mode or aperture priority or shutter speed priority. Now, while clearly these modes can give excellent results, they don't give me the precise control, simplicity and quickness I need. So it's always manual mode with auto ISO for me. I use the front dial just below the shutter release to control the shutter speed and the back dial at the top to control aperture. The camera then sets the ISO accordingly. As you'll know, the aperture controls the size of the opening in the lens. The smaller the f number, the larger the opening. Often for perched and general bird photography, I need to use the largest or widest apertures, for example f4 on my 600mm lens. This is because the available light is often suboptimal for much of the time in the UK. I'm often shooting in adverse weather conditions. It's cloudy and it rains a lot in the UK. And I often shoot in dimly lit surroundings like the woodlands at Haywood Reserve. Wide open apertures allows as much light as possible to get through the aperture to the sensor. Importantly, aperture also controls the depth of field. The widest aperture of a lens provides the shallowest depth of field. The advantage of a shallow depth of field is that it can provide blurred backgrounds with wonderful creamy bokeh. And the nearer you are to your subject bird, the shallower this depth of field and the creamier the bokeh becomes. Additionally, the nearer you are to the bird, the more pixels you can get on it, and the more detail you'll get in the final image. Exquisite detail in the feathers, for example. For all these reasons, many bird photographers, myself included, strive to get as close as possible to the birds, but never too close to disturb the bird. This would change its normal behaviour and may drive the bird off. Never a good idea. But there are downsides to getting close and shooting wide open. There's always a trade-off. If you have the fieldcraft to get close, have a wide open aperture and focus on the bird's eye, a must for all bird photography, it might be that the bird's body and the tail might appear out of focus because the depth of field is so shallow. This can be wholly acceptable in some images, while unacceptable in others. If you want or need more of the bird to be in focus, then you'll need to stop down the lens to as much as f8, or sometimes even more. Typically I shoot between f4 on my 600mm lens and f8 for all my perch and general bird photography shots. f4 is a wide aperture which is great for background blur and bokeh, while f8 gives you greater depth of field if you need to have the whole bird in focus. The choice is yours. So in manual mode you have complete control of the aperture, but you also have complete control of shutter speed. Shutter speed is also really important in perched and general bird photography. While motion blur is less of a problem with perched and stationary birds, you have to make sure you have a fast enough shutter speed to negate this. Even perched birds can move their heads and tails quickly, which can create motion blur. Additionally, with larger telephoto lenses, which can move like sails in the wind, you do have to grapple with camera shake. Now the normal rule of 1 over the focal length for the minimum shutter speed applies here. So normally my perched and general bird images are shot at around 1/600th of a second. But I may need to shoot faster if the bird is moving about, for example being thrown around on a twig blowing in the wind. But it's more likely I'll shoot slower shutter speeds to accommodate a wider aperture like f8 if it's needed, or to lower the ISO and raise image quality. Shooting at slower shutter speeds is usually fine if you have built-in image stabilization and you have something to lean the camera on to keep it still, like a window frame in a hide, a branch of a tree or a fence post, a rock, or indeed a tripod, which I sometimes use for perched and general bird photography. I'll cover this in more detail in the next video on general bird photography, technique, tips and tricks. Now just a quick word on ISO. Manually selecting the perfect aperture and the perfect shutter speed for each shot is fantastic, but I always keep an eye on ISO when it's selected by the camera. Often ISO becomes very high and images too grainy, so I may have to give up some depth of field or shutter speed to bring the ISO down to an acceptable setting. With the Sony system, just like my old Canon system, my aim is to keep ISO as low as possible. Shooting at the native ISO of 100 would be perfect, as this produces the best image quality, but I'm normally happy with my Sony cameras if the ISO is 800 or below for perched and general bird photography. The lower the ISO, the better the image quality, assuming you have the right aperture and shutter speed, and as previously discussed. That said, with modern noise reduction software you can achieve great results at very high ISO settings. Here are some examples. So I'll stomach high ISO settings if it means I have the right aperture and shutter speed for the shot in front of me. In a while I'll be showing you my favourite perched and general bird shots I've taken over the last few years. And based on your comments from the previous videos, I'll not only give you the settings for each image, but I'll also give you the names of the birds. Hopefully this will help. So in manual mode with auto ISO, I have all the control I need to take what I hope to be perfect perch and general bird images. A quick word on image stabilization. Currently I always keep image stabilization on for perched and general bird photography and in mode 1. As I said earlier, this allows for zero camera shake at lower shutter speeds and lower ISOs and therefore better image quality. All of my perched and general bird images are shot with stabilization on. But what about exposure compensation? If you let the camera select ISO, a perfect exposure will not necessarily result every time. For example, a white bird like a barn owl perched on a post in front of a dark background is likely to be overexposed if you rely on the camera to select the ISO. And a black raven or two sat in some bright grass is likely to be underexposed. In these instances you'll need to dial in some exposure compensation. Now the beauty of mirrorless cameras over DSLRs is that you can see these exposure issues real time through the EVF. In these instances it's easiest to dial in some exposure compensation, 1/3 of a stop for each click. Moving the dial to the right anti-clockwise makes the image and subject brighter, and moving the dial to the left clockwise makes the image and subject darker. Drive mode is a personal choice for perched and general bird photography. My aim is to change camera settings as little as possible in the field, so I use continuous shooting with the highest frame rate the camera provides. That's the same drive mode I use for birds in flight, simples. But unlike birds in flight, I rarely fire long bursts. I shoot 2 to 3 frames at a time, which means I have more chance of getting at least one, if not all 3 in perfect focus, with the eyes wide open and with a perfect head and body and tail position. I'll cover technique and composition for general bird photography in the next video. So on to focus mode. I use continuous focus 100% of the time for perched and general bird photography, the same as I do for flight photography. Now I know many great bird photographers use single shot focus because the subject is stationary, but in my experience birds are rarely stationary, and if they are, it's not for long. They might be moving about in the wind perched on a branch, floating about on choppy water, walking and scurrying around on the ground, and just constantly fidgeting about. You'll never stop this movement even if you use a tripod. Coupled with this, I'm rarely still when taking shots, but I'm constantly moving no matter how slightly, and particularly with large telephoto lenses in my hand, especially as I keep tripod use down to a minimum. So keeping continuous focus on for perched and general bird photography and biff photography just works better for me. Some bird photographers use manual focus or dynamic manual focus DMF. Now never be afraid to give these a go if you feel it'll work for you, but I find continuous focus delivers the results I need for me. While on the subject of focus, let's talk about back button focus. From my last camera settings video, you'll know I use back button focus. I like the way it separates focusing from shutter release. So I use the back button to focus and press the shutter release to take the shot. As I shoot continuous focus all the time, if focus was tied to the shutter release, I could never turn off focus when taking a shot, unless I use a dedicated focus hold button, which would confuse things for me. There are times you do need to hold focus when you take a shot, however. For example, a perched bird in a tree surrounded by branches and leaves blowing in the wind. You want to focus on the bird's eye, but the foliage keeps interfering with the line of sight. Continuous focus could result in focus moving to the leaves. This would be a great time to have a quick and simple way of holding focus on the eye. By moving focus to a back button, I can focus when I want and hold focus when I want, just by releasing the button. I could also recompose the shot before shooting with the shutter release for a better composition if required. I explained how to set up back button focus in a previous video, so I won't go over it here again. So back button focus means you have greater control over when you focus, but it also comes with some other advantages when selecting focus areas. Now, as I've already mentioned in the previous video, Sony provides 14 focus areas to choose from. I only need access to 4 of them. This covers my birds in flight and perched and general bird photography needs. First, I limit the areas I have access to, which makes selection of the right focus area a lot quicker, and I showed you how to do this in the previous video. Now, I don't use the tracking focus areas at the moment. I prefer to track the subject in the viewfinder. Now, the introduction of the Sony A1 and improvements to AF may change this if I can ever afford it. I use wide, zone, flexible spot and expanded flexible spot, and I assign focus area selection to the C2 button. First and foremost, I use the flexible spot focus area. This is excellent for perched and stationary birds and allows you to focus precisely, for example on a bird's eye. I also sometimes use the expand flexible spot focus area. This is good for birds moving around, where it might be difficult to get a spot on the eye. Expand flexible spot focuses via the centre spot, but uses the 8 focus points around this to acquire focus if the centre spot can't. Both these focus areas are flexible in the sense they can be moved around the viewfinder to the bird's eye to enable perfect composition. I can toggle these 2 focus areas using the C2 button. They are 2 of the 4 focus areas I have available, and I focus using the back buttons. Usually I access one via the AF on button, and the other is assigned to and activated by the AEL button, using the AF area registration function I described in the previous video. Through this function provided by Sony, I have instant access to these 2 focus areas at any one time, using these 2 back buttons. If a bird in flight opportunity presents itself, I can also quickly use the C2 button to toggle to wide or zone for the flight shot. And I can do all of this without taking my eye away from the viewfinder. The rule of thumb is to use the smallest of these focus areas that will get the job done. Invariably, this means I use the flexible spot focus area for most of my perched and general bird shots. So as we approach the end of this video, I've just got a couple of other bits of advice. If you are close to your subject, you can set your focus limiter to an appropriate range on your lens to prevent focus hunting, and this will mean that you'll snap onto the eye more quickly. Also, if you're so close to the bird that you're within the minimum focus distance, then you're either going to need to use extension tubes to get focus, or you're going to need to back away from the subject. Anything to help you get the killer shot. And for perched and general bird photography, I tend to use the electronic shutter because there are no rolling shutter issues because there's very little movement in the frame. So I use electronic shutter, and that's silent, so as you're closer to birds you're not going to scare them away, so that's a good tip. The other thing is I still use, in terms of the shutter release priority, I still use focus. I want all my shots to be focused before the camera fires off, but other people use other priorities. So that's my favourite perched and general bird photography settings. Sorry it was a little bit long-winded. As I said, in another video I'll take a look at my techniques, tips and tricks for general bird photography. All that remains is to show you my favourite perched and general bird photographs from the last few years. And if you like what you see and would like to see more, then please like and subscribe to my channel before you leave. So thank you for watching. I'm off to do the washing up, and bye for now.